Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for giving your time here today to listen to some presentations and, just as importantly, to participate in a dialogue through your questions today and in an ongoing conversation here in Glasgow about transport, people and place. My name is Duncan. I'm from Glasgow City Council, and it's my privilege to chair today's event, to introduce our great speakers, and also to try roughly to keep things to time, but most importantly to curate your questions. I know many of them will be coming in during the speakers' presentations, and you can use your question box on the control panel to participate through that mechanism. As many of you will know, this is the second webinar that Glasgow City Council has been hosting along with our friends around Links, and we are looking to inform your thinking as well as our own with the experience and lessons we're going to hear from our speakers, and with the dialogue that goes along with that. So we've got 5 great speakers. Each one of them is going to draw upon their experience and the lessons they've learned to offer us for our reflection. But just as importantly, I think, and for myself personally, is the blend of those speakers and the overall reflection that we're able to make upon their support for our own thinking here in Glasgow. Now, the title, as I said, of this particular event is A New Vision for Transport, People and Place. And as many of you already know, transport itself is responsible now for the largest proportion of carbon emissions in Glasgow and Scotland. So the sector itself is a key one for decarbonising our economy and society. We know that air quality is a key urban concern around the world's cities and especially in Glasgow. We know too that walking and cycling are some of the most evidence-based low-tech public health interventions that can improve both physical and mental health and social cohesion. And we know that place and neighbourhood and livability has become a significant issue, not just before COVID with the debates we're having, but especially as we look to move from COVID and also to address the climate emergency we already knew to be looming upon us. So I'd encourage you during the presentations you're about to hear to use the question function on your control panel. We know that many of you responded already through the survey online for the council. I'll remind you at the end of this event how to access that. And we know too that many of you already have taken part in the council's climate emergency survey last year, and prior to that in the development of our community plan, during both of which it was quite clear that transport and connectivity came up as single most significant issues for many of our residents and many of the people interested in seeing a better, more sustainable Glasgow built in the years to come. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our first speaker of 5, and we'll try as best as possible to keep the time. I'll remind you once more to use the question box on your control panel. I'm going to mute myself in a second and introduce my colleague, Ross Martin, who's one of the participants in Glasgow's Connectivity Commission and is going to draw upon his reflections from that work for you now. Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan, and good morning, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I think there's a slight delay on the line, but that's because I live in central Scotland, and we're still trying to get to the digital highway, never mind any other. But talking of highways, I just want to pose one question right at the start of this session. And so the question, kind of in memory of Eddie Van Halen dying yesterday. And so the question is, why is there a highway to hell, but also a stairway to heaven? And that's because it frames the discussion which we're having around road prioritisation and transport choice, and it's about choice. I chose to give up my car at the start of 2020 and decide to use public transport around central and around central Scotland and further afield for all of the work that I do on regional economies across Scotland and down into England and over into Northern Ireland and the like. And actually pre-COVID, during those first 3 months before the lockdown, it was a much easier transition than even I would have thought. And much to my colleagues' surprise, I was actually turning up on time for meetings, physical meetings, and being in the right place at the right time for the right thing. And making that transition to me was a huge learning experience. But it's also been a learning experience fast-tracked by the COVID experience and our response to COVID. And what we've seen throughout the last 6 months is really a fast-tracking of a whole set of those behavioural changes, just like that one which I made, into the public psyche. And in many ways, the public have got ahead of public policy. But thankfully, we have examples across Scotland. I'm going to talk about Glasgow and the Connectivity Commission. Daisy after me is going to talk about Edinburgh and the work that they're doing there. So examples where public policy and politicians and policymakers have stayed at pace with the general public and with their mindset and with the behavioural changes and their attitudinal changes which come from that. And that recognition that the COVID crisis and any other pandemic to come are really Mother Nature's way of giving us a good old kick up the backside and saying, this is not good enough, you need to change the way you engage and the interaction between people and planet. And what transport allows us to do is to see that relationship through an everyday experiential lens. And so what we did in Glasgow's Connectivity Commission was to gather all the evidence around in terms of how people get into Glasgow, how they get back out of Glasgow, how they move around Glasgow. And when I say Glasgow, I mean the Glasgow City region and not just the city. And it's really important in the Scottish context to talk about the city region and not just the city, because the travel to work area, the housing market area, the labour supply catchment are the lived experience of people. They're the functional economic geography if you're an economist. And it's at that scale which change has to happen, which is why the first recommendation from the Connectivity Commission was a city region metro, and the first arm of that being the link to the airport and then out to Paisley, Gilmour Street. So through the hospital campus, out to the manufacturing centre, and joining up all of those hotspots of activity along the south of the Clyde. So that was the first of 3 recommendations. The second recommendation was more about people coming into and getting out of Glasgow. And so that was extending Central Station out over the river, landing it in Tradeston, much the same as Blackfriars does over the Thames in London, in order to accommodate inverted commas HS2 or whatever comes in the form of high-speed rail along the backbone of Britain. And then the third recommendation was to fix that crucial missing link in Scotland's railway network, which sits at the heart of Glasgow's transport system. And that's the missing link between Queen Street Station and Central Station. There's a breakage in the system there, which not only isolates parts of the country, Ayrshire for example, from the rest of the country, but it also reduces massively the capacity at both Queen Street Station and at Central Station. And so those 3 recommendations, one across the region, one a national stroke international link, and then the second one a national key missing link within the Glasgow transport system. And so the rationale for each of those proposals was to maximise the utilisation of the fixed rail network and to bring back into being roughly about £1 billion worth of infrastructure which sits around Glasgow, not performing any function at all whatsoever. And if we can bring that back in and reconnect the places which need to be connected to the economic vibrancy of Glasgow, then we can see a huge uptake in productivity and a real drive towards inclusive growth. There was one map which you'll see in the Connectivity Commission report, which I'm sure everybody's read, which overlays the areas of multiple deprivation in Glasgow with the fixed link transport system. And shock horror, each of these areas are areas which aren't connected in any way, shape or form. And so the opportunity to get to work, to get to college, to get to university, to actively participate in Glasgow's economy is much diminished. And so there's a burning urgency to reconnect that third of the city's population, which is completely detached from the economic vibrancy of the city and the city region, back into the system, and therefore transform the life of the city and the region round about it. And so with those huge recommendations, and it's about £10 billion worth of infrastructure required, roughly 333 for each of those elements, then what we're beginning to see is the focus for both the Scottish Government and UK Government, as well as the local authorities within the Glasgow City region, taking on each of those projects and being serious about the transformational change which they can bring. And not only transformational change in terms of people's behaviours, but transformational change, as Duncan was describing, in terms of the emissions aspect and the decarbonisation of the transport network. And if you put that in a bigger, wider context around how do you replace UK internal flights, for example, with HS2, how do you electrify Scottish internal flights and make Glasgow the centre of a network of that, and how do you ensure that local transport is decarbonised, then you have to do that whole package, and the Connectivity Commission recommendations were exactly designed to do that. So if I can just take a couple of minutes on each of those areas. So in the City Region Metro proposals, then what you see at the moment is Glasgow has more on-street car parking than any other comparable city in the UK. And the Glasgow city centre is dominated by car traffic, or it was in the pre-COVID period. What we're beginning to see through the COVID period and through that lens is the opportunity to mix things up and to change things. And so a lot of the work which is being done in terms of the Places for People programmes and the Avenues project, etc., falls in on the back of that and recognises the value of changing the nature of the proposition and the hierarchy for road usage. And so the metro system clears out a lot of those possibilities, connects those different places to the areas of economic vibrancy and activity, and enables people to get around the city and the city region in a way which hasn't been possible to date. And so what you see in the council's plans are the overall transport strategy, the city centre transformation plan, and the Liveable Neighbourhood plans is really the same process, just at different scales. How do you take local, how do you take citywide, how do you take region-wide accessibility and connectivity and integrate them into an overall strategy which enables the city to function as a city, but also to function as the heart of the city region, and the city region to function at the heart of the national transport network. And the recommendations from the Connectivity Commission were the underlying infrastructure asks in order to make that happen. And so how do we drive those big capital interventions into long-term behavioural changes? Then you need to ensure that land use and transportation, for example, come together through the national planning framework and the regional spatial strategy. You need the regional transport strategy to ensure that the national transport strategy is built around the needs of our great engine of Scotland's economy. And you also need the national economic strategy to be built around the vibrancy of the Glasgow city region economy, but recognising these elements that need brought back in, and you can only do that by reconnecting the places which are disconnected at the moment. So I suppose in summary, we can take the Connectivity Commission report and the recommendations which is made, and summarise it in 3 words: decarbonise, digitise, and diversify. So decarbonise, obvious in terms of the reduction in the CO2 emissions. Digitise in terms of the customer experience, integrated travel options, integrated opportunity in ticketing, integrated opportunities in terms of marketing, and being able to encourage people to make that shift out of cars and into public transport and active travel options as well. And then diversify in terms of the choices and the options available to people, because the context in which we travel changes not only every day in Scotland, but it changes by the hour in Scotland. And people need to have that choice in order to make sensible decisions around how they get from A to B, whether it's to work, to live, or to play. And so what we're hoping to see, and it looks like we've gained considerable purchase with the recommendations which we made, is to create that bigger context for the city centre, and then the city, and then the city region, and then its place in the national economy, to recognise the value of that transformation, and to see transport, and the key final point is to see transport and transport infrastructure not as pieces of transport kit, but as the economic arteries of the regional economy and of the national economy as a whole. And so that's, I'm sure there's a whole load of issues in there for people to question around, to think about, and I think it probably leads pretty nicely on to Daisy. So I'm going to hand back to Duncan at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your introductory remarks there for us on your experience at the Glasgow Connectivity Commission, Ross. Just a couple of things. 1 or 2 people were asking, were they missing a slideshow there? You weren't. You haven't missed anything. Ross was speaking to camera, as it were, so you haven't lost anything there. Secondly, 1 or 2 people asked for web links to the Connectivity Commission's 2 reports, which we will distribute afterwards. For those of you who are on the Glasgow City Council website, if you just put into the search engine Connectivity Commission, you'll get the reports via that medium as well. Okay, enough from me, and on to our next speaker. Daisy Narayanan is Director of Urbanism for Sustrans, and she's going to give you a presentation now, particularly focusing on community engagement. Over to you, Daisy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Duncan. And thanks so much for inviting me this morning, because it's an absolute privilege and honor to be here talking about Glasgow when it's right at such a critical point in shaping its future of what transport is going to look like. And as always, it's a joy to share a panel with Ross. You know, he's always inspiring. I know he mentioned at the start, Ross, you mentioned how you gave up your car, and I remember following that journey that you made on social media, and I could see how people were responding to that and being inspired by that. And so there's something quite powerful about the stories that not just what you experience, but how you tell your stories and how that comes across. And I suppose that's what I'd like to talk about today. How we take, again, as Ross was saying, the digitizing element of what you talked about, Ross, and how you bring that into community engagement and speaking to people and learning from people and collaborating and co-designing in these extraordinary times that we find ourselves in. So so for me, it goes without saying that we live in strange times. Ross picked up, you talked about the COVID experience that you've had and how that shaped some of the thinking around the work that you're doing as well. Less than 18 months ago, I was on secondment to City of Edinburgh Council, leading a project called the City Centre Transformation. And as part of that project, we led 2 big city conversations. And what that looked at was similar to what Glasgow's doing right now, was what our streets and what our spaces would look like within the World Heritage Centre in Edinburgh, what the low emission zone could look like within the city, and more importantly, how we could ensure that any work that was done within the city centre was linked to a local and a regional plan. Again, as Ross mentioned, how critical it is that you need to have a regional plan that influences what happens to our local streets and our streets. We said during the city centre project that you cannot pedestrianize the Royal Mile without that being part of a wider regional conversation. But the way we had those conversations across Edinburgh looks very different to how you would have that now in Glasgow. We had workshops, we had one-to-one discussions with community groups, we had meetings, leaflet drops, walkabouts on site with people who who were local to the area. I was out 3 nights a week for 8 weeks, just talking about what the plan was, what we were trying to do, how can we do this together. But in these extraordinary times, as I said, the conversation with Glasgow, with the city, will need to take quite a different shape. So I'd like to focus today on what happens when more and more we need to use digital technology to engage with an audience. How do we adapt? How do we change? And more importantly, how do we learn? What do we learn from this period as we emerge from lockdown and face the twin challenges, as Duncan was mentioning? Ensuring a green recovery from COVID and making sure that we are still not forgetting that the climate crisis hasn't gone away; it's still looming. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to set out some of the just a quick reminder of some of the good principles of what good engagement looks like, the clarity that's needed on the relationship we're trying to build with our communities, and running through the process that we would normally use as part of a traditional community engagement conversation with around change that needs to happen. I'd like to use a space to move tool that Sustrans created, where we had to very quickly go digital first for engagement on temporary road schemes. And finally, I'd like to end on a reminder of the challenges that are faced by, when we go digital first engagement. We need to make sure that we are able to reach all demographics. I want to make a point about online civility at the end. So that's the kind of thing that I'd like to focus on over the next 8 to 10 minutes. Next slide, please. So essentially in Sustrans, sorry, the previous slide, thank you. In Sustrans, we're working towards 2 strategic priorities, which is the Paths for Everyone, which is primarily as custodians of the National Cycle Network. And our second strategic priority is livable cities and towns for everyone, where our vision is that our cities and towns must be places that connect us to each other and what we need, where everyone can thrive without using a car. And for me, the word connection is so important. It's not just about physical connections. It's not just about digital connections. It's about human connections and making sure that we are together in this, regardless of the context that we find ourselves in. And so for me, it is critical that as we have the conversation, we have to bring together stakeholders with different backgrounds, different agendas, people who live, work within, and who know the places that they belong to. Citizen engagement is fundamental to fair and representative decision-making in urban planning. And we all know the scale of change that's required, and we can't even dream of acquiring that level of change or achieving that level of change without the widespread and proactive engagement of people, and making sure that the vision that we talk about is positive, and that we are constantly talking about how we do this together. Next slide, please. And we know what good community engagement looks like. The national standards for community engagement, good practice principles that are designed to improve and guide the process of community engagement. The 7 standards: inclusion, support, planning, working together. There's methods that we would use, communication, and impact the measurement of impact of what we do. Next slide, please. But to do that, we have to be very, very clear on what it is. What is the relationship we want with the particular group or particular sector, or what discussion we're having at that point. Are we informing people? Is it a consultation? Are we involving? Are we collaborating? Are we empowering communities? And each of these conversations will have a different way of approaching it. So we need to be very clear at the outset. What is it that we're trying to achieve from a particular conversation? Next slide, please. And so this is how traditionally we would go out and communicate, and how we would approach urban design. We would scope and plan out what needs done. We would co-discover what the barriers and opportunities are. We would co-develop with key stakeholders and who can support implementation. co-design with community workshops to design solutions that are particular to the areas, to the place, co-deliver, come together and deliver change together. And finally, make sure that there is a legacy that you leave behind, that you are able to empower your volunteers, you're able to empower the wider community to continue the work that has been started as part of the process. So that's what we would do in a traditional setting. Next slide, please. But as I said, everything's changed over the past few months, and we've had, I think, all of us across, across this room, everyone who's part of this conversation has had to be agile, has had to adapt, and work. How do we work together, and how do we reach out to people to talk about the changes that need to happen quickly and that need to happen, sometimes without the traditional, the consultation methods that would have gone into place to put these changes in place. So as an example, at the end of April, Scottish Government announced the Spaces for People programme, which is a rapid response to creating space on our local streets for social distancing. It was very much a public health-led programme. And one of the key aims of this programme was to create temporary changes to our streets, collect data, collect evidence, to help shape the longer-term aspirations for what we as citizens collectively want our cities and towns to look like in the future. And in Sustrans, we decided to challenge ourselves and our digital teams within Sustrans to help local authorities start to gather this data and gather this evidence. So we created a tool called Space to Move, which helped to get both qualitative and quantitative data on people's experiences as the changes to the streets were put into place. Next slide, please. So the Space to Move tool was launched on the 8th of May, which for organizations that are starting to look at digital was quite a rapid fire process within Sustrans. When we launched it in May, there were 42 schemes that were launched across the UK. By the 15th of June, we had 190 schemes, and at the end of August, we've had just under 800 projects logged onto the system. Next slide, please. And the creation of this tool was, again, only possible because the timescales. Within the timescales, we could only do it because there was a process of digital transformation happening already within Sustrans. We started to look at new tools. We started to look, as we manage the National Cycle Network, how do we make sure that we can open it out to a wider range of stakeholders? How do we tell stories? So we started to look at some of these digital tools that we could use. And we're only now, as we start to look at how they can, we can be agile with it, we're starting to understand the potential of this technology. Next slide, please. Because for me, these are all just tools, your surveys, your questions, the data we collect, that is what is important. And so more, digital tools combined with principles that I just talked about of traditional community engagement can be a really powerful way to reach across people, across our cities and towns and our neighborhoods. But I'd like to end, next slide please, on a provocation, because digital engagement, isn't a panacea. We have to ensure that engagement doesn't end up as a tick box exercise. As these tools grow in sophistication and ease, you can see that as we work, things are getting easier on Teams and webinars and Zoom and Skype. Tools are changing every day. We have to, how do we ensure that we don't lose the unique human connection that is required for us to make meaningful change? Inclusivity, is it possible with digital first engagement? How do we make sure that we are truly including, people's voices, marginalized people's voices, voices that Ross talked about, who are not part of the conversation right now? How do we ensure that trust is there within organizations? How do we build those two-way relationships that we are able to empower communities with? We live through such an uncertain period. How do we design processes that we can adapt quickly, based on latest public health guidance? Partnerships, our local groups and stakeholders are still able to reach new audiences. Do we need to change our partnerships? Who's going to pay for it? It takes time, it takes commitment. And finally, as I said, I want to end on online civility, because we have to make sure that these spaces are safe for the public dialogue that is necessary for the scale of change that we want to see. Social media can be a toxic place. I have personally witnessed, over the past week has been particularly difficult for me personally because of some of the toxicity that's out there. And I don't even, I'm not in public office, I don't have a public role. And change makers who want to challenge the status quo often face a torrent of abuse, mostly anonymous. So how do we collectively, as we move towards a whole different way of engaging, of having these conversations, ensure that digital engagement becomes more normalized? We keep our online spaces safe, democratic, and kind. And to reinforce that note of kindness, I'd like to end on the words of the Sufi poet Rumi. And Rumi says, before you speak, let your words pass 3 gates. Is it true? Is it necessary? And is it kind? And I think more than ever, we need this not just in the lives that we lead, but more so in the online spaces that we create and we work within as we make change happen. I'll stop there. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Daisy. I really appreciate your contribution there, learning about your experience and also your final thoughts especially. We have a robust and disputatious local democracy in Glasgow, and that's absolutely right. There's no reason why it can't be civil or kind. And so your final comments are particularly opposite. Thank you. We've had lots and lots of questions coming up during Ross and Daisy's presentations. By necessity, we can't answer all those questions, but what I'm going to do as chair is try to blend some of them together to pick out principal themes and put them to our speakers. Probably the most significant one that's been coming up is around buses. People have asked about the role of buses as opposed to other forms of transport. They point out that it's really significant for Glaswegians, particularly Glaswegians from more deprived neighbourhoods. And they also ask about experience, particularly from Lothian buses, about the kind of operation that we have here in Glasgow and whether municipal regulation or control is possible. I'm going to pass over initially to Ross for your reflections from the Connectivity Commission there about the significance of the bus network, the importance of it for Glaswegians, and where going forward we might work with private operators and look at maybe a degree of public oversight. Over to you, Ross, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Duncan. So just a quick word about Lothian, given past experience. So my final political decision on Lothian region back then, just at the reorganisation of local government, was to maintain Lothian in public ownership. And that wasn't through any sense of dogmatism. That was a practical sense that we had then, and there still is now, a fantastic bus company which operates across the area. It wasn't operating quite as extensively as it is now, but which operates and serves a particularly good function and suits that circumstance. But that's not to say that that particular model suits all circumstance. And so what we looked at in Glasgow in the Connectivity Commission was the bus setup that we have there. It's too fragmented, yes. There are too many historic routes which haven't been changed to change with change in demand, yes. There is not enough clear road space, yes. There's a lack of a bus terminus in the south part of the city centre, yes. And we recognised all of those things, and that bus is a key aspect, but the culture of using buses in Glasgow is so different from the culture of using buses in Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, everybody uses the bus. Doesn't matter what background you're from, it doesn't matter what part of the city you're from, everybody uses the bus, and there's a long-held, long-standing culture which we need to build in Glasgow. There's only a small section of the population use bus in Glasgow, and we need to broaden, need to diversify the usage of busing in that regard, and we need to make sure that busing is an integrated part of the network, along with the metro system and along with the train system, and an integral part of the active travel gig as well. And so our very first recommendation was around the nature of the Quality Bus Partnership, and that relationship between the City Council and the biggest bus provider first, and trying to fix that aspect of it and use that as the building block for a much more progressive, integrated, modern, accessible, digitised, decarbonised bus network, which would mirror what happens with Lothian, but not necessarily structurally.
Thanks for your answer there, Ross. Daisy, I saw you nodding along at points there. Do you want to add any thoughts from your experience?
Yeah, just a quick point. I sit on the board for Transport for Edinburgh, and it has been a difficult time, as you can imagine, as part of COVID. So there are discussions ongoing, obviously, as we move forward. How do we make sure that walking and cycling, public transport are as integrated as they can be as part of the move towards low carbon future in Edinburgh, which I think is hugely exciting. I don't think those conversations have happened as much as they should, even in Edinburgh. So that's been quite good. But I hope you don't mind. I have this lovely story that Malcolm Fraser, who's an architect in Edinburgh, mentioned when I met him a few months ago. He said his mum, who's in her 80s, travels by bus in Edinburgh everywhere. And she says that the bus drivers spread cheer across the city because, when you go around, they go, hello, how are you doing? And so they play such an important role within the city for spreading cheer, which I thought was lovely. So I use that all the time. Sorry, I just want to share that little story.
That's a great story. Thank you, Daisy, and a necessary one in these at times rather fractious moments for us all. My next question, I suppose, is very much following up on your final thoughts from your presentation, Daisy. I'm summarising again a number of different points here, but essentially it's about how people engage with each other in the policy conversation, how pedestrians and cyclists can live together, particularly when pavements come into use by cyclists, how the acceptability by the public of 20-mile-an-hour zones can be worked through. And I suppose the heart of those questions was how are our shared spaces going to connect us, and how they're going to lead to a form of community consent for some of these developments, particularly obviously with some of the interventions that have occurred through the COVID crisis. Do you want to maybe just reflect a little bit there, please, Daisy?
Absolutely, there's a lot in those questions, and just I suppose from my perspective, we don't have a choice. I mean, we have to have those conversations. We have to make it work. The space in our streets are finite. And we have to make sure that we are able to have those conversations in a civil manner, as I said, to make sure that, within the context of each place or each space, each street, we are able to understand what that means and who uses the space and who, how then we reshape it to make sure that it fits within the wider agenda of the council. It needs political leadership because these conversations are not easy. And I think we see that in Glasgow, we're seeing that in Edinburgh, we're seeing that in many places. It needs storytelling, it needs civic leadership, it needs people to go out and to explain why change is needed, and not have to keep having the argument about cyclists versus pedestrian versus buses. This is about equalities, it's about equity, and it's about how my 7-year-old daughter has an equal right to share a street as somebody in an SUV. The reframing of the conversation, to me, is critical. It isn't about one mode of transport pitted against another. It's what kind of place do we want to be in? And finally, I think there is such a huge amount of support for decarbonization, for wanting to leave our planet in a better place. And we see that everywhere. We see that when we have our conversations, at whatever forum we're at. And why then does that, when you look at something on social media, suddenly turn to be something quite different? So for me, there's something about making sure that the huge amount of support that we do see for projects and for the schemes that are being proposed, we are able to take that and amplify those voices as well. And finally, my final point is about making sure that's inclusive, because you can't have a real conversation if it's just a few people having that conversation in a bubble. And however difficult it is, we need to have those robust conversations in a civil way. I keep coming back to civil. You can see I've had a tough week. And then, make sure that we make change together.
Many thanks, Daisy, for that. Ross, I'm gonna maybe move on to another question, if you don't mind, directly to you. Thanks very much for your reflections there, Daisy. Ross, a number of questions coming up around, I suppose I might summarise them under the title of integrated ticketing. Not an unfamiliar issue for many Glaswegians used to trying to get different modes of transport. People have asked, look, can we move beyond the current zone card system to get a truly integrated system, particularly involving obviously buses, trains, and potentially also cycle hire? And I know people sometimes add car club and electric vehicle hire and so on to that. Do you want to just reflect a little bit on your experience there, and particularly with the Connectivity Commission's discussions?
Okay, so three things, Duncan. One, integrated ticketing isn't that hard technically. but there's a barrier to it in Scotland because there's a split between devolved and reserved powers around the regulatory aspects of that. And so there's a real challenge at that, and we really need both governments to work together on that aspect of it to clear out those barriers. Two, the second barrier has been the lack of thinking at the regional level, at the travel to work level. I mean, obviously that pattern's changing in the COVID era, but nonetheless, there's been far too much fixed boundary thinking within each local authority's administrative political boundary, and not enough with the areas round about. Glasgow lives and breathes because of the broader population around it. I mean, I often joke around, if you look at Ayrshaw's GDP figures, they're lower than they should be. And I often joke that when you walk through Central, you know, on a busy day, if you were to walk through Central Station from Gordon Street down to platforms 15, 16, you see Ayrshaw's GDP walking towards you. And so there's a need for thinking at that scale, and hence the issue around the regional metro system. And if you can develop that kind of thinking, then integrated ticketing becomes much easier. And then I think the third aspect to the integrated nature of ticketing is, I would be even more ambitious than just the Glasgow City region. Central Scotland should have a single ticket mechanism. You know, whether we get to the position where other cities are heading in terms of free travel or not, you know, we need to be able to move around all of the economic activity across Central Scotland, and not just in each of the 3 key regions: the Glasgow City region, the Forth Valley, and the Capital City region. These need to be integrated as well.
Thanks for your reply, Ross. Daisy, some final thoughts from you. I saw you again nodding along to some of the comments there from your experience over in Edinburgh. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with what Ross said. You know, it's not difficult to integrate. There's no technical issue where you can do that, but it has to be done as part of a wider regional plan, as I said. There are interesting discussions around, you know, free public transport, especially as we come out of COVID, and how that would work. And you know, if we do that, then how does the integrated ticketing work? There are things that we need to unpick before we move on to what the solution could be. And I think what Glasgow's doing right now with, you know, holding these conversations and learning from other places is just fantastic. Thanks very much, Daisy. Well, we're keeping well to time. I'm going to move on in just a second to our next set of 3 presenters. We're up to almost 200 participants, so that's fantastic. To all of you out there, please keep your questions coming. And at this point, I'm also going to say a big thank you to Daisy, because I know you have to leave us at this point rather, so we won't be able to hear more of your thoughts on the panel later on, but thank you so much for your contribution here today. We are now going to move on to our next set of speakers, and our 3rd speaker is Lucy Musgrave, who is the founding director of Publica, and she's going to talk a little bit about strategies and design for people-focused public spaces. Lucy, thank you for coming today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I'm just going to check one thing so that I can share my slides with you, because I have a lot of slides to show, and I'm hoping that they're going to work. Yeah, indeed. Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me, and yeah, really fantastic conversation so far, and really inspired by both Ross and Daisy's contribution and the questions. I'm going to speak a little bit about our work with some London-based and international case studies to hopefully complement much as what has been said already. And I'm going to rattle through quite a few slides, so hopefully it will work technically, and if not, then please do interrupt me. So yeah, I'm from Publica. We are urban design and public realm consultants. I'm a mayoral design advocate, and I advocate for diversity in the built environment, alongside a particular methodology and approach to civic amenity. So hopefully this is going to be a useful visual essay to sort of walk us through in terms of some of the themes. Our methodology is basically looking very closely at the complexity of cities in terms of movement, looking at every different perspective of all citizens and all users, ensuring that we are building a real reality check in terms of everyday use, in terms of mobility justice, in terms of the demographic profile, in terms of the policy context and the civic leadership that's already been discussed this morning. And nowhere is discounted. Cities are the most surprising and multi-layered places and really deserve our close attention. So we see ourselves a bit like investigative journalists. We're looking at the city 360 degrees. We're researching the economic, the social and spatial, cultural and environmental conditions. And we're doing that in a participatory way so that we have an evidence base that we can all share. The evidence base needs to, we think, be framed within a set of values, and we call the field that we work in civic urbanism. So the concept is that cities are constantly being renewed, they're always in flux, they ever were, that in the 21st century, our cities need to be more efficient and more hardworking materially, socially and economically. That the specificity of place, the meaning that we attach to actual places and the symbolic value of that place is absolutely fundamental to all citizens. And that it's about co-creation, just as Daisy was saying. This is about interdisciplinary, both top down, bottom up. It's people trespassing across disciplines and seeing actually that citizens are the experts in terms of city life. And what is shared and captures all of this is long-term thinking. Communication is really important. So visual communications, working with multiple different stakeholder groups, ensuring that that research and that evidence base, the mapping, the films, the animation, the engagement is really clearly communicated by civic leaders is absolutely fundamental to our world. And we all know, and I mean, you're wholly aware of this, and I'm just going to repeat things that we all have got in the forefront of our minds in terms of a time of emergency. But in terms of our environmental and climate emergency, we know that cities are our problem. They're also our solution, obviously, but we really have to deal with this in terms of the impact of climate change on citizens. Of course, we're right in the middle of a global pandemic, and we are wholly aware of the public health crises, plural, that we have got, both in terms of the pandemic of coronavirus, obviously in terms of mental health, in terms of issues like childhood obesity, and these issues of multiple levels of deprivation in terms of that link between, injustice in terms of mobility and injustice in terms of people's social and economic life. This slide is just from the Health and Social Care Information Centre in London. It is shocking that we have nearly 40% of our children and young people are seriously overweight or obese. It really is a public health crisis beyond the pandemic. And also we've got a problem that we don't trust each other. So, you know, that's just been touched upon both by Ross and by Daisy. But this was some research that was done by Grosvenor last year. The people who responded to their investigation, 9% of their respondents trusted people in the private sector, and shockingly, only 7% trusted people in the public sector. So we've got a real problem. On top of that, we've got what are we going to do with our town centres and our city centres in terms of what is going to happen to our retail, what is going to happen to the jobs, what are we going to do in terms of movement. You know, this is just 2 photographs from lockdown in terms of central London. We have a real crisis in terms of need to think about land use differently. We do have a hook, though, to think about our forward mission, and that is well-being. So, you know, the Office of National Statistics has given us this lens in terms of how we can measure and think in a really joined up way about this concept of well-being, and I really want us to hang on to that thought. We've also got the behavioural change that Ross was just mentioning about in London in terms of the cycle hire. It's doubled since lockdown. We've got really extraordinary work being done on in terms of low emission, the ultra low emission zones, but also low emission neighbourhoods. I know you've got that in Glasgow as well in terms of all the good work that's happening in terms of your civic leadership, and this is really having an impact in terms of health. We've got strategy and we've got policy. So City of London last year, which is one of London's boroughs, adopted a transport strategy that very radically said they were going to take out 50% of the streets in the next 22 years and make them pedestrian priority. And since the pandemic has hit, they've been thinking about how they can accelerate some of the issues about both surface car parks and subterranean car parks and use them for logistics. So using electrified cargo bikes and you know, actually delivering by trolley in terms of dealing with air quality and really thinking about the last mile logistics. We've got, sorry, my screen has just frozen, bear with me. We've got a really important local leadership, sorry, I'll go back one, in terms of initiatives like, for example, school streets. So it's, I'm sorry that Robert Nichols can't join us this morning from Hackney, but Hackney piloted and have been really, really inspiring leaders in terms of pioneering this concept of school streets. There were 5 in Hackney last year. There are now 415 school streets since July being announced across London. So real local action. And we've also got proper civic leadership in terms of some really good strategic thinking around joined up policy. So this is the Good Growth by Design suite of documents. We have been very fortunate to contribute to some of them. And one of them was the policy that we set for making London child friendly that was launched this January. And this isn't just about family friendly. It's in fact not about family friendly. It's about independent child mobility, that child as a rights-based issue can actually independently move through the city as children and young people. We do a lot of work looking at international case studies, and sorry, my slides are still not moving for me, so bear with me, I'm sorry. My apologies. I hope that this is going to work. I'm going to talk to you a little bit. Okay, so we went to Colombia to talk about our work on the River Thames with the Mayor of Bogota. I'll just click back one. And we went to Medellin to look at this concept of social urbanism, how they've used design and culture and participation and civic pride to completely rebuild the city in the poorest neighbourhoods first and think about mobility for all of those citizens. We've looked constantly at places like Paris, and obviously everyone's looking at the 15 and the 20-minute-mile city, looking at how the river has been, reappropriated for climate mitigation in terms of flood defence, but also as a playable space for the young and for the old. And we're also looking at housing renewal. So this is some of the field work that's on the slide at the moment, looking at how we're looking at social housing estates and housing renewal. The experts of how social housing are the residents themselves, and we cannot afford to be tearing down our housing estates. So thinking about carbon and about participation is really critical in terms of housing. Sorry, and that goes on to Paris that I just spoke about, so my apologies. Further afield in terms of blue infrastructure, this is some of the work in Korea that's been happening, reusing pieces of infrastructure, thinking about cycling and walking, thinking about green infrastructure. So very briefly, I'm just going to touch on some of the ways that we've been trying to help in terms of this idea. I know your commissioner is looking at this issue of vehicular movement. London had its roads task force and asked this big question about the movement of people and the movement of goods and how we service buildings. And that has led to many priorities being taken about the removal of one-way traffic gyratories and aspects of the inner ring road. And a lot of Publica's work has been looking at this issue of civic amenity and the space between buildings. We've been working on about 12 of these projects. One of them I'm just going to start off with is Kingsway and Aldwych. This was when London County Council was formed at the turn of the last century. London had its government and it decided to actually lead with a public health initiative, which is to make this beautiful boulevard. And I just throw this up because it was really clearly articulated. It should be a great thoroughfare and it should possess beauty and civic dignity. And I think that word civic dignity is really important for us in the 21st century. This is how it functions today. Nobody can cross the road. It's very, very polluted. So we had an opportunity because the Somerset House Trust had taken what was a civil service car park and turned it into this much loved place of civic amenity and creativity at Somerset House. And therefore we were asked, Publica was asked to work with Somerset House, with King's College London, with the London School of Economics, with the Business Improvement District, and set a brief for how we would remove this one-way traffic gyratory. We're doing this across London. So one of our other projects is Marble Arch, reconnecting the Royal Park to Oxford Street. This is an aerial photograph from 1922. It's actually the Prince of Wales arriving back and doing a kind of processional route through the National Monument. I think it's really interesting because it was 3 years after a global pandemic that killed between 20 and 100 million people, and people are standing shoulder to shoulder. But that's not why I'm showing it to you. Our job is now to move the inner ring road because now we've got 15 lanes of traffic between Oxford Street and the Royal Park. And how do we do that? So we're working with all of the stakeholders. This has been promoted by Transport for London, Westminster City Council, but also importantly the Portman Estate, who really want to think about how we can join that Royal Park back to Oxford Street and respect the National Monument. At Bond Street, we were asked by Westminster City Council to design Bond Street from top to bottom, so from Oxford Street to Piccadilly. We are very proud of this scheme because it won the Best Public Realm Award in London last year. We've basically kept all of the traffic management the same, but we've put the highway on a diet. We've really thought carefully about the civic amenity, designing the benches, the public art, the lighting, the enclosure. We can see this now as a town square, but actually this is the before and after. Working together with a team of contractors and the transport planners has been absolutely critical. And green and blue, very briefly, just to touch upon it, I know that you, like London, have adopted the concept of a national park city and are thinking very carefully about your infrastructures and how they can be linked up. We were asked in the removal of another big traffic gyratory at Baker Street to join Royal Park to Royal Park. How could the greenery action plan that we put together support the low emission neighbourhood that Westminster City Council were promoting? And there was a whole series, I want to talk about trees very briefly. There were a whole series of trees that were bought for a major project on the River Thames that actually wasn't so popular and didn't happen, the Garden Bridge. So Transport for London and the Garden Museum began to think, what do we do with these trees? And we were asked to think about how would you, in the arboricultural landscape, how could you use trees in terms of some of the ambitions? So we set a whole policy around safer routes to school, thinking about how this box junction was changing in Lambeth and how the Garden Museum's own ambitions could use those trees and use them for good. Talking about waterways, the Port of London Authority and the GLA asked us to help them with a case for a cultural vision for the whole of the River Thames. And in pink on this map is where the jobs and the housing are coming in London. Over 40% of the opportunity area planning frameworks touch the River Thames. But our mayor has a very expansive idea about culture. It's not just culture in terms of the World UNESCO heritage sites or the cultural institutions, it's about culture, everyday culture for everybody. So what we did is that we put together a really participatory programme and we used lots of international case studies to look at actually how people are making their rivers part of their cultural identity and access to them. We did it with about 100 different stakeholders, both statutory and non-statutory stakeholders, through these 5 themes, thinking about the environment and ecology, movement and commerce, community skills and education, the development and the investment, and culture, heritage and tourism. And we're doing this at the moment for Lancashire County Council because they asked for an economic feasibility study thinking about the Liverpool-Leeds Canal and the part of that canal way. And I know that's something that you're working on in Glasgow at the moment, thinking about actually how communities, identity, in Lancashire they call it the super slow way, about actually how they can begin to think about this post-industrial landscape. So widening definitions of culture, just to wrap up. First of all, something I can share with you in about a week's time is the GLA is just about to launch the work that we've done setting a policy for the evening and nighttime strategies for town centres and for the city centre. So this is a toolkit for how the borough champions can really think about extending the day in our COVID times, but also think about all those jobs in terms of hospitality, thinking about the cultural industry and the creative industries, and how can we begin to think about looking after our town centres and our city centre in the evening and night time. We're working with the design guardians for the Oxford Street district for Westminster City Council, and we're looking very carefully with the leader of Westminster City Council about the history of Oxford Street. It was a place of innovation, it was a place of culture, it was a place of the music industry, and how can we make this a really bold participative vision to reopening this district. We have set the policy, it was adopted last year for the whole district from Marble Arch to Tottenham Court Road, so it's not just about a shopping street, it's actually about the district and thinking about it holistically. And this year we've been setting the measurements of how we're going to look at, through these objectives, how we can measure success on civic amenity, the material strategy in terms of sustainability, play, strategic walking, the evening and nighttime, the green infrastructure, and on culture. And we're doing it with the Westminster Youth Council, but we're also working in other high streets like Kensington High Street, working with the Kensington and Chelsea Youth Mayor and the Youth Council. And I just want to say that actually this issue about participation and governance is critical because the younger generation are demanding of us in terms of the opportunity to think much more boldly in terms of social and environmental equality. I'm privileged to be on the National Infrastructure Commission's design group, and we've set our principles so that actually it's about also setting the really big infrastructure projects of national significance as well as the super local issues, and doing that with best practice in mind. And I end on a quote, and I love this quote because it's about the infrastructure of everything. Infrastructure means unity, unity among parts that are individual in themselves, but in the totality containing them, they form a universal whole. From this point of view, each thing is the infrastructure of the next. So I suppose that's my contribution, is try and say, let's look at this thing holistically. Let's look at it socially, culturally, environmentally, economically, and let's think about mobility justice, that join it up in terms of the civic amenity and participation of all citizens in Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Some really interesting food for thought there, and I was particularly taken by your focus on mobility justice, which I think is a key Glaswegian issue and one that's been coming up in some of the questions as well. So thank you very much, Lucy. If you want to switch your camera off now, we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is John Dales, Director of Urban Movement and someone who's been involved in work here in Glasgow for a while now. Over to you, John, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Duncan. Good morning, everyone. It is still morning. Yes, so I'm from Urban Movement, and I'm going to say almost nothing about what we've been doing in Glasgow. You'd be glad to know, because what I've been tasked with doing is actually standing in for Robert Nicholas from London Borough of Hackney, as Lucy mentioned, and he was going to talk about low traffic neighbourhoods, and so I'm going to try and cover some of the same ground as well, if that's all right. I'll touch a little bit later on something specifically that Robert's been doing in his role at Hackney, which is school streets, and it's a slide that Lucy also popped up, and I see in the chat that you'll be able to find out more information about that in due course, which would be great for you to do. So I want to be talking about what Robert was talking about, and creating low traffic neighbourhoods, and I want to talk about it from a couple of perspectives. One is my professional one, the way that we're involved in this in a number of cities at the moment, but also my personal one, because there is a low traffic neighbourhood that is proving extremely controversial, and where I live is right in the middle of it, and so some reflections on that. I believe that Landor is organising a conference on low traffic neighbourhoods specifically in a couple of weeks' time, and as far as it's for me to do some publicity for them, I urge you to get in touch with that if you want to know more about how we might deliver low traffic neighbourhoods, or rather some of the details and perhaps the technical design aspects. What I want to focus on is actually picking up a lot from where Daisy left us earlier, in terms of the issue about they're relatively simple to design or conceive. They are much more difficult to implement successfully and with public consent. And so, if I may, one of the things I really want to focus on, it might seem really obvious, next slide please, is this phrase low traffic. And I think you would like to share your webcam. Yes, I'm going to share my webcam. Everybody needs to be able to see my new haircut. There we are. What strikes me in all this about low traffic neighbourhoods is that it's really easy to avoid, but really essential not to avoid, the fact that the heart of all that we're trying to achieve in terms of responsible public authorities trying to create livable neighbourhoods, and that's whether we're talking about residential neighbourhoods or commercial neighbourhoods, indeed on main streets as well. What the heart of what public authorities are tasked with doing, at the heart of where most of their policies lead them in terms of economic policies, environmental policies, transport policies elsewhere, is that the future must involve less motor traffic. We must be talking about less motor traffic mileage. It's a tricky issue to talk about, but actually if we don't, and we don't engage on that basis in terms of thinking about low traffic and the broader need for low traffic, then I think we will always find ourselves on the back foot. It's easy to make the case, I think. At least we have to try, because what often happens is that we are trying to sell low traffic neighbourhoods, for example, on the back of your personal street. Now you have rat running or whatever it might be, and we'll get rid of that for you, and it'll make your street nicer. Well, okay, some people might not think that's a particular problem. Where I live, on my street, we are on one of the more obvious sort of rat run routes through our neighbourhood, but I wouldn't describe it as being intolerable. There are many other people in our neighbourhood who actually, they have no, the nature of the network at the moment, they have virtually no through traffic. And so for them, if you're pitching it straighter that you can have less through traffic, for them it's just, well, there's no gain there. And if I now have to go a long way around, that's just pain. If all we're pitching to them is that issue of no rat running in front of your house. So next slide, please. The heart of this, and we need to get as much data of this kind as we can. So this is just some data from London, is that a huge amount of existing motor traffic is over very short distances. It's therefore reasonable that we might propose that a lot of that can translate. And here are some data. You can pick up look at these slides in due course. I shan't trouble you with too much of that, but basically there's a lot of transference that is possible. And what I was interested, if I can go to the next slide, please. I've seen a local residents group do something that actually their council hasn't done yet. And it's saying, look, we support this trial. There's a lot of opposition. We support this trial because, and they have then put down this simple thing is we believe the council is right to try and reduce the amount of traffic in order to, and then all of these things here. We need to reduce congestion everywhere, not just in your streets. It's not just about rat running. And obviously some of the concerns about Liveable neighbourhoods or low traffic neighbourhoods, well, you're just going to put that traffic on the main roads and it'll be worse there. And people live on those main roads, which they do, and their air quality is going to get worse, which it might. Now, how do we deal with that? Well, we have to deal with the fact that actually we need less traffic and less congestion generally. There's obviously the public health issues as well, which is the reduction of pollution, and that can only be overall. We're not saying let's concentrate it all on main roads and not on your privileged residential streets, which again is a narrative that's out there. But also we do need to enable more people to walk and cycle, to have more active lifestyles. We need to reduce the number of people killed and injured. So there's road safety dynamic going on, as well as the climate change issue in terms of reducing greenhouse emissions. These are all things that every council has got its policies about. And I think we just need to be open and honest about this. It's so easy to, I don't want to deal with that. People are fed up with hearing about the obesity crisis, and some people are deniers of the climate emergency and so forth. That may be the case, but this is what we're talking about. We are actually talking about low traffic, not just in the neighbourhoods, everywhere. And I think it will serve us well for all public authorities to be really quite clear about that. It's very easy for them to do so. Most manifestos, there's been an issue in our area about a lack of democracy because of consultation through trial. Really, it's easy to play that because they haven't consulted on the low traffic neighbourhood in the way they did with CPZ recently, which is repetitive. But obviously there's an additional element of the emergency at the moment. The COVID emergency at the moment, but also this is the best way of doing it. Let's find out how it works. Let's look at how these arrangements work when we understand the actual experience rather than what we fear or hope for. Let's be honest about that. Plus, the manifesto says we're going to do exactly this thing, and all of their policies say we're going to do exactly this thing. So I think we just need to be clear about that. What's interesting is this residence document not only makes us a really broad case for this, but also, next slide please, goes on to say that, and this is critical, and I think if we fail to get this message across, then we might well fail, which is key to this, key to the low traffic neighbourhoods and to all the benefits of reducing traffic, is that the root of all the negative effects of motor traffic is, next button please, motor traffic. And it's inescapable. And therefore, what the residents go on to say is that the reasonable approach to dealing with motor traffic isn't to try and spread it around through more roads, like residential streets. Neither, of course, is it to try and concentrate on some unlucky corridors. And that's why LTNs are intended to enable more people. And this is key, right? There's all of those short journeys. We've got the data for that. If you haven't got it, look it up. You'll be able to find some of it. Even right now, it'll be there for you. So what we're trying to do is a lot of those really short trips, really many of them, but we're not saying everyone's always got a reason as to why you can't, why they can't, or somebody they know can't. And we're not talking about that, need to be clear about that. But we can swap a lot of those really short trips of walking and cycling, or simply don't do that short trip by car now, do it as part of a longer trip next time you're out. This is kind of popular dialogue, as it were. Next slide, please. And one of the things that's really useful to do, this is again some stuff from residents, is okay, what's the positive side of this? And we need to lead with it as far as possible. This happens to be in my neck of the woods. And that tree there, interestingly enough, is all the leaves on it, or the bits of green, are actual proposed LTNs. There's a borough map there. And this idea of residents sort of owning their the bollards and the planters and things they put out. There's been a lot of vandalism in our way, but actually relentless positivism and good humour, I think, can help, because, next slide please, what you get and what you often have, and it's the kind of thing that Daisy spoke about in terms of an online presence, you get it virtually as well. You have a lot of people, a number of people, never anything close to a majority, and especially the really, really angry ones are a very small number, but they have a reach. If you are on social media, it can be very difficult to engage on social media with people who are already committed to as it were, a very anti and very often abusive approach, and I simply wouldn't engage. That's my take on that. So you can see a lot of opposition, and some of this is entirely self-interested. Some of it, to be perfectly honest, is generated or provoked or enabled by the fact that actually the bigger message hasn't been sold. Communications are poor. If they're poor, if they don't really explain why we're doing this, why we're consulting by trial, why this is necessary for all of us, you leave yourselves open then to, well, what about all these things? Like, what about people who live on main roads? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. What about access for emergency services? Perfectly reasonable question. And if you don't handle your communications, if you haven't started on the right foot, then sometimes it can be really difficult. The real heart of this, next slide please, is that I've used this before in presentations, and this is a slogan from Sky TV, in fact, is it's encouraging people, its would-be viewers, to believe in better. Most people don't. They really struggle with that. They know what they're going to lose, and that's what they can focus on. I'll have a long way round. They might even be aware and quite supportive of. They might cry when they listen to David Attenborough on the telly. They might be really upset when they see forest fires in Australia and America. But actually, when it comes down to them, they're not necessarily people who live with these things at the moment, so they hold that on one side. They are concerned broadly about the environment, but when somebody suggests that they're going to have to drive a long way round, that is just the thing. Well, that's what I do every day. You're changing my life, and things are already bad enough. One of those actually posters, banners that somebody was holding at that demonstration I had a slide of just before, said something along the lines, it's already bad enough. So fair point. So just quickly, if I might go on to the next slide, here are the three things. If you could just pop straight through all three of them, please. Thank you. These are three things that I learned from a woman called Fiona Burton of the Leith Agency. I'm sorry to talk about an agency based in Edinburgh on a webinar focused on Glasgow. These three things are well worth thinking about, and thanks to Fiona for them, which is basically, let's understand how people react. People do feel loss intensely. We need to understand that in terms of how we communicate about low traffic neighbourhoods. We need to also understand that actually, if a couple of people, small number of people get angry really quickly, then people are looking around for what are these low traffic neighbourhoods? What are they? They'll look to others to work out what they should think about this thing. So again, all the importance of positive early messaging. And then in terms of messaging, the third point here, I think, is also especially important, this idea of sometimes as councils, it's very difficult to have the right sort of language. We can't admit fault. And so we have to suggest this is a great thing. And rather than perhaps recognizing, look, we know that for some people this will be difficult, but come with us because there's a greater good. That kind of openness and honesty, it's sometimes called the pratfall effect. It's a very odd one, but this idea that actually people quite like their experts, for want of a phrase, who don't point fingers. And actually my view about what people are saying about we don't like experts, it's not really experts that people are objecting to. I think it's people who use their knowledge to appear to be know-it-alls. We know better than you do, and point fingers. And so I think if our messaging is really honest, recognizing the kind of issues that people will have, and some will, there will be pain for some people, and just acknowledging we don't absolutely know what will happen as a result of this. And yes, we know the main roads are a real issue, and we're working on them as well. Very important. And as I often say, I think one of the key things in all of this is we may be sure, because of our policy background or all the evidence we got, that what we're trying to do is the right thing. If we can't get to build it, if we can't get to do it, then all that good news and all that knowledge and evidence could go to waste. So that's why I'm stressing this issue about, well, how do we get this across? Next slide, please. So there are some positive things we can do. Instead of road closed signs, how about road open signs? This is a woman called Sarah Berry who produced the one on the left, which is wonderful. And actually, if you notice the one on the right on the actual planter, And we've got somebody locally to me has put a woman on the bicycle as well, just made it slightly more inclusive, and which is great. Somebody's turned a planter into a bench, and we've got a couple of planters in our area outside pubs. That would be great, wouldn't it? Actually, I'm not quite sure about public order issues, but I'd sit on it. Next slide, please. And then this is just a generic slide which includes photograph bottom right from Glasgow. In fact, some work we often do, and I think is really important. It's obviously challenging at the moment, specifically, but one of the whataboutery issues is what about disabled access, for example, which I didn't care about 30 seconds ago, but I now understand it's an issue. We need to, that's what people might say, we need to be really open. So in other words, we need to do our equalities assessment of all these things really thoroughly, even under the current circumstances. It's a duty we have, and it's something we need to focus on, and no amount of haste can get away from that. It's something that doesn't have to take a long time. We just need to give it some proper thought, and actually engaging with local people as far as we can would be good for doing that. Just to finish, next slide, please. I just want to touch on the fact that as well, so getting data as far as we can. There's a lot of data that helps inform decision making would be useful. Some of it's already out there, and if you can get it under the circumstances, then do as well. This idea that what people think, in this case business owners, this is from Waltham Forest, some of the work they did for their early low traffic neighbourhoods as part of what was called the mini Holland bid there. What traders thought wasn't what their customers actually did. That kind of information is really important as well, and presenting it in a way that's easy to access rather than just a bunch of bullet points is good too. Next slide. You can look at this document. I shan't say anything more about it, but actually it's a really useful document produced by Transport for London that talks about the kind of things that you can do in neighbourhoods that don't cost much, that can make a real difference. Next slide, please. And just quickly onto this is your school streets, and Lucy showed this, and the document on the left is something that Robert's had a lot to do with, and it's a document you can download, and I think Juliana is going to provide you with links for that. And the heart of this is, this gives me an opportunity to use a photograph I took years and years ago, which is a Weetabix advert, and that's almost at the heart of what we're talking about here in terms of low traffic, this idea of turning the school run into a stroll. All those short car trips that could become walking if we create that. And there's a beauty about that. There's something really attractive, I think, about that slogan, about that idea, that almost everyone, even parents who are in a hurry and put their kids in their SUVs in the morning to do short trips because life is like that, if they're given an opportunity to think differently and to think, well, this is good family time, 15-minute walk, maybe just put the clocks that get the alarms going 10 minutes earlier, everyone wins. And we need to start thinking about how we effectively do that messaging. Just quickly on school streets themselves, I was involved earlier in the pandemic, the very beginning. Next slide, please, on some thoughts about how we deal with school streets. So if you could just pop the next three things, thank you very much. School streets at the moment have normally been thought of as basically time restrictions on access to the street or streets where schools are. So temporary restrictions on vehicle access other than for locals. There's much more that we can do as well, especially in the context of the pandemic, and this relates to, which is actually how do we get space? That's all very well having no cars, but if the carriageway is still pretty much a carriageway and some vehicles come through, how can we think about actually creating space for the kind of queues that many of you will be familiar with outside of schools as we're waiting to go and a lot of that distancing. So we need to make sure, my suggestion there is actually we not need just to keep vehicles out of the carriageway, but also need to create more space for walking, for wheeling, and also for waiting. And then the third aspect of that, which Lucy was also touching about, is actually, and then this is part of the positive messaging, how do we make that look and feel much better, much more welcoming? What can we do to that in the long term and in the short term? So this is turning the idea of school streets from just these time restrictions on vehicle traffic and not much else, to be perfectly honest. I should say that item 1 is really good. Let's start developing those in terms of 2 and 3, because that's what we're starting to feel that will help make the neighbourhood yet that much more livable, not just short time restrictions of vehicle access, but much more enabling of people walking, waiting, socialising, even under the current circumstances, they can do it safely, and then perhaps a more beautiful and welcoming place. Thank you. Final slide, I think, and it's simply this. which is the back of all this, is we need to be focused on. This is a great cartoon you may have seen. I think it's about a decade old now. And it comes back to my original point, which is we're not just talking about doing a thing the council must do. We really have to do this. And actually just supposing all of this, imagining just supposing there isn't a climate emergency, all these things we are trying to do can make your life better. And that's at the heart of what we're trying to do with livable neighbourhoods. People reacting negatively to low traffic neighbourhoods, the idea of livable neighbourhoods, going around with banners saying, save our streets to keep driving on, really? We need to focus on the fact that your streets, I know you're used to them as you are, but we can transform them, and that will be better for you. It'll be better for all of us, in fact, if we take this overall view that what we're looking for is livable cities and genuinely low traffic, not just neighbourhoods, low traffic cities too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for some inspiring practical examples of work there, and also reminding us of the significance of the individual street level and what street level engagement with residents and users means as well, with all the challenges that go with that. If you want to cut to your webcam, John, please, we're going to move over to our fifth speaker, who is Jason Gooding from Nottingham City Council, renowned throughout local authority land across the UK as the first to have introduced a workplace parking levy. And we're going to hear a bit more about that in Jason's presentation. Over to you, Jason.
Hello, everybody. So the purpose of this presentation is just to give you an overview to the workplace parking levy scheme that we introduced in Nottingham. Actually went live with charging in April 2012, so it's been around for quite some time, but it's probably not that well known. We'll give you some thinking behind the scheme, why we did it, and also some of the impacts and outcomes. So next slide, please. So workplace parking levy, it is a congestion charging scheme. There is powers given to local authorities through the Transport Act to enable them to tackle congestion. And the better well-known scheme is the road user charging scheme in London. As many of you will know, it's an infrastructure scheme. All traffic movements are pretty much captured and the individual is required to pay a charge. What's less well known is the workplace parking levy scheme. Now, this is a scheme that focuses very much on commuter parking, not all travel movements. Commuter parking, and it's focused on employers. So employers have to gain a license and pay a charge, and then that income is used and ring fenced back into improving things like public transport infrastructure and services. There's quite a key point there that it is actually ring fenced, so it's not something that just generates money that can go off onto anything. It has to have a very clear plan to help tackle congestion. Next slide, please. So the thinking behind the scheme, I think with most cities, you've got to look at things like your congestion levels. It can start to strangle the city, its economic vitality, inward investment can all be affected by congestion. In Nottingham, a lot of our studies show that 70% of our congestion during the peak period was made up of commuting traffic, and probably a very similar story for most other cities. It wasn't through traffic, it was destination traffic, so it's coming into the employer sites in the city. We have around 3 million people within 1 hour travel time of Nottingham, so there is quite a heavy dependency on cars, but we also have some very 2 award-winning bus operators in the city as well as an existing tram line. What we were thinking though is, look, how do we continue to grow this city without becoming strangled? A simple accident on the ring road could see mayhem caused on the road network, more people coming to live in the city, with more people demanding to drive or travel, and it was unsustainable to think the car or road building was going to be a solution. The aim of the levy is to place that charge, it's to look at commuter parking, which is predominantly by employers, and to place a charge on employers. That encourages them to manage and minimise the amount of workplace parking they provide. And then secondly, it creates a revenue stream that we can do for investment into infrastructure and services to try and help encourage more people to travel by sustainable means. Next slide, please. So pretty much, I'm just going to take you through the next couple of slides just to really talk about the levy, and just so you get a bit of an understanding. Today you can go away and think, well, actually, I know what it means. So first of all, you have to define what a workplace parking place is. So it's where an employer provides a parking place for its employees, its regular business visitors, which is basically like a contractor, consultant, somebody who's like an employee but not directly employed, or pupil or student, which is in the legislation. So if you went to your workplace today, if you drove in your car, you parked up and walked into the office, that is pretty much what the employer has to work out and has to license. Next slide, please. It then works, we'll start to just touch on some of the detail, but there's obviously a lot of detail and we can provide information afterwards. I'm very happy to say we'll share contact details and can give you a lot more detail on the scheme, but in principle, it works on the maximum number of workplace parking places that an employer provides. So they'll look at the car park, they'll work out how many employees, regular business visitors are there, and they have to license that. In Nottingham, we've applied the scheme to all employers within our administrative boundary, but we're talking to a lot of other local authorities, both in the UK and actually now internationally, where actually the WPL is an admin scheme. It's very easy, very adaptable. It can be targeted. Some of the London boroughs that we talk to are looking at real focus schemes in and around either business park or, you know, particularly in roads where a lot of the employment sites might be. So it doesn't have to be the whole city, but then places like other cities are considering that. So again, it's a very adaptable, very sort of tailored scheme. It is a charge on the employer. It can sometimes be confused. It's a charge on employees. It isn't. It's actually on the employer. It's a legal obligation under the legislation. It means the employer has to license and pay that charge. However, we do encourage and support employers because we know one of the direct impacts of a scheme is if an employer manages their car parking, and if they start to reduce that car parking or put in things like parking management, and you pass a charge on to the individual, it starts to impact direct travel behaviour. If an employer just pays it, okay, there's going to be very little influence on their employees' travel behaviour. But then the council will use that funding to put in things like public transport and infrastructure services to give a choice, so people can consider, is a car the right thing to do? Do they want to sit in congestion in the car going in, or would they rather go for traffic priority, things like trams, buses and other means? More active travel seems to be a very big thing at the moment that's starting to really take off as well. So next slide, please. In Nottingham, again, we've got the scheme, but then we've had to tailor it to make sure it suits the city's requirements, addresses some of the main concerns. So we've got in there, we've got two things, we've got discounts and exemptions. A discount means you have to license that parking, but you get a discount from the charge. And in Nottingham's case, it's a 100% discount. But again, all the local authorities are thinking differently, you know, 10, 15, 20% discount and a range of schemes. So with our discounts, one of them is on small employers. So for any employer that provides 10 or fewer liable workplace parking places, will receive 100% discount from the charge. And we have a lot of small employers in Nottingham. We also have discounts for emergency services and the NHS and blue badge holders. Now, with them discounts, we actually remove around, I think it's around 75% of employers actually licensed but don't pay a charge. And what we found is actually the majority of workplace parking is actually contained with the larger, medium to larger employers. So the discounts have enabled us to sort of focus the scheme very much on the people who are having the largest effect, but also stand to benefit from the improvements. Another thing with the scheme is it's very easy for people to be misunderstood, miscommunicated by the media or hearsay. And exemptions, we don't charge customer parking. It's not a tax on parking places. So something like a supermarket with a large amount of parking places that is very much focused on allowing their customers to drive in, pick up the shopping and go. The only places they have to license are their employee places or their regular business visitors. It's not every space. If that space isn't occupied by one of them types of drivers, it doesn't need to be licensed. So again, there's quite a lot of sort of misinformation that we had to address, especially being the first of its type. It was quite a long journey for us, but I think it'll be a much shorter journey for the local authorities. Next slide, please. So we put the scheme in 2012. The impact was that we had over 2,000 employers had to obtain a license. But again, as I just spoke, with the discount exemptions, only around 500 pay a charge. This is spread over about 850 chargeable places. And we've focused very much on trying to make sure the scheme is not administratively onerous. So we focused a lot on making it very easy for employers to understand their legal obligations, how they work out their maximum occupancy of workplace liable places, how they obtain a license, and also how they comply, because because there is a number of civil and criminal offences in legislation. They ain't much to stick, but what we try and do is encourage compliance by working closely with employers and helping them. We have not done an enforcement approach, we've done a compliance approach, which has worked very well for us. We also provide, as part of that, quite a lot of significant business support, both before the levy went live and also ongoing. So we do travel planning support, we've done personal journey planning, we've been providing cycling and grant support, parking management support, where many employers have said, well, I'd like to manage my car park, reduce my liability, and also generate an income from that car park to cover the costs and also their liability. So 53% of liable places are now covered by parking management schemes in Nottingham, which is quite a significant step change. Before the levy, very few employers had a parking management scheme. In Nottingham now we have a lot. We also do, sorry, that's the postman. This is one of the benefits of working from home. We also have traffic management as well. We invest quite a bit of money in traffic management, making sure that we've got things like residence parking schemes. Sorry, residence, the dog's going a bit crazy. Residence parking schemes, and also things like pay on display schemes to make sure that if there is any displaced parking through the WPL, that we address this and we don't have a negative impact in residential areas. Should employees choose not to park on site, then we make sure that we manage the highway effectively. So next slide, please. So some of the outputs of this, the impact we've seen, we've got the employer's license, we've got the scheme to go live, but some of the things we're very proud of in Nottingham is the way we work the scheme and work very closely with employers is that we actually achieved 100% compliance. So all the employers that are liable and provide liable workplace park places have obtained the license, and that was from year one. So we've got a lot of effort in saying, look, we want to help you get this right. We're not just going to turn up with a scheme and say, get a license and pay us a charge here. No, we're going to work with you, and you're also going to understand the benefits of the approach. We've generated over £75 million in the first 8 years of the scheme, which is not an insignificant amount of money when you think locally we've generated that. But what it has done, which is really a big message for other local authorities to consider, we've actually levered in over £600 million of external funding into the city because we've got a local contribution. We can put funding towards pump priming, seed funding, we can do match funding, and that's helped us in Nottingham bring in some major public transport infrastructure like a tram extension. We've been very successful in our bus services and investing in our bus services in Nottingham, and also regenerating our train station, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The scheme is also, its administration, but it is very, very robust. We've got a very clear and comprehensive way of collecting data on employers to look at their liability and ensure they're compliant. By educating employers and sharing that and working on a compliance approach, employers understand that we can actually prove very easily their maximum occupancy and their commuter parking, which enable us to generate, collect over 99.9% of that £75 million. Which, when we've actually written off less than £10,000 of £75 million of income, it's a pretty impressive stat that we're very proud of here. We've also not issued any penalty charge notices today, which, compared that there is significant penalty charge in the scheme, we've focused very much on that compliance approach and education. We'll work with the employers. It's not going to benefit anybody issuing loads of penalty charge notices against employers, because we need employers. We want employers in the city. They help the city grow and be economically vibrant, but at the same time, they also have a duty and a good part to play in tackling congestion. And through that, we actually operate at less than 5% of operational costs. So we've really got a very small team. We've focused very much on making sure the operation is very efficient. It's easy for employers to license, and it's easy for us to do the compliance. That means 95% in every pound that we collect goes into that public transport infrastructure improvements. Next slide, please. So in Nottingham, what have we done with that? Well, we had a tram line. It was in the good old days where the government funded 100% of it. It was great. People were very impressed with it. It was a tram line with a small spur servicing some of the junctions on the M1 motorway. What we want to do, we had a vision to turn that into a network, doubling the length of the system, and we did that. And from that, we've actually got 19 million passengers a year travelling on there. It serves and connects some of the most deprived areas of our city, giving them access to employment. It's also encouraged a significant amount of inward investment, both housing and employment, along them tram routes, because it's fixed infrastructure. So people are knowing, look, this scheme's here for a long time, and it's generated a lot of regeneration. We also redeveloped our train station, and we contributed to a £65 million project to revolutionise the station. It was quite poor, it wasn't a gateway to the city. And both the tram and the station were two of the top 3 business priorities in Nottingham. So it's very good for us that we could say, look, although we're charging you the levy, you can actually see that what we're going to do with it, we're going to deliver some of the priorities you believe will be successful for the city. We also put a significant amount of funding into what's called the Link bus network, which is where we fund bus services where they probably help connect up to the commercial routes. So we have Trent Barton and NCT and bus operators, award-winning bus operators in the city. But what you do find is that's very much the travel into the city and back out. And what we've used the Link buses to do is to link sort of the radial routes around the city, with over 8 million passengers now a year on them services. Could I have the next slide, please? So we do like to say it's award-winning because we have got 2 awards over the last 8 years on this scheme. But I think what we find with the WPL is we're talking to a lot of other local authorities now. There seems to be an interest to say, well, we know you've been doing this scheme, but what is it about? What does it do? Could it work for us? And we're starting to show other local authorities it's a very scalable scheme. It's very adaptable. It's not right for everybody either. It's not. It's one of them options that you can do. That if you've got a vision for your city, as we had, where we wanted a tram network, we wanted the station upgraded, we wanted to improve and expand our Link buses. If you've got a vision for the city, this could be part of that plan to generate the funding that will enable you to create that step change in infrastructure and services. I think we've got a proven model. We were the first of its type. I think there was a lot of scepticism about whether or not we'd get it right in Nottingham, and hopefully some of the slides have shown you. We feel we've got a very robust model here, and we can support other local authorities because it took us a long time to do it, but you can do it quicker. You can do it at a much lower cost than what we did if you follow our model. You can do it at a much lower risk because we've got a proven scheme that does work. There has been no legal challenge in the scheme, no judicial review, and we've got very high rates of compliance. And I think just to summarise, if we didn't have a WPL, would we have delivered our vision? We wouldn't have had a local contribution. We would never have been able to afford the tram. And we would have never levered in that £600 million of external investment. And there would have been no incentive for businesses to change their behaviour. Why would they have put the parking management schemes, manage their car parks, reduce their workplace parking? And how would we invested in the public transport that would have then enabled us to grow as a city? We do not sit here wanting to be constrained by congestion. We want to grow this city, but I think people have to travel in a sustainable mode. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason, for a fascinating insight into Nottingham's intervention, which I know, and I'm sure you're well aware of, many other local authorities throughout the UK and here in Scotland are interested in exploring. If I could ask Lucy and John to switch back on your webcams for this final panel session. We're doing really well. We're doing really well for time. Got a number of questions coming up. I'm just going to kick things off as a starter with a specific one for you, Jason. It's specific to the workplace parking levy, but it's a kind of general one for any city, I suspect, thinking about introducing this. The question to you is, if private cars are reduced going into cities, would the space simply be backfilled by other users, such as light and heavy goods vehicles? And a corollary to that is the second part of that question is, does the employer get incentivized to repurpose the surface parking space that is freed up? You're able to maybe just give us some thoughts on that one, Jason, from your practical experience, maybe your discussions with other cities too.
I think one of the things we've looked at in Nottingham, we didn't set this scheme out to say it will cut congestion. We've not said, look, congestion at this level and it's going to go down. What we've said is we're going to tackle the growth in congestion. Nottingham is a city that wants to continue to grow. Do you know what I mean? We want more people to come and live here, work here, visit. So it was very clear that what we're trying to do is tackle the peak period commuter congestion, try and look to move that onto more sustainable modes such as the tram, buses, and train. I think it is acknowledged that, look, we all know getting people out of cars is a very difficult challenge. But if you look at the challenges facing local authorities now, climate change, air quality, and carbon neutrality, the challenges are there, and I think we're all seeing that actually probably public perception is starting to change. I think using the car and expecting to be able to use that freely to go everywhere, you can't go to nearly any city now without expecting to pay for parking. But a workplace, you could go and park there for free, and many of these were located right in the middle and centre of the city centre. So, yeah, I think it can be controversial. I think trying to tackle any sort of car usage is always controversial, but I think we've got it probably about right. I think you've sometimes got to look at the price. The price for us was landing that vision. Was the price of tackling cars and probably doing a controversial scheme? Yeah, I think in Nottingham we'd say it would. It was maybe not right for every city, but I think it was for us. Just on your second point, where you said about incentivising employers, one of the incentivations is that obviously they can reduce their WPL liability, and we provide that quite extensive business support to them. And some employers, one of the classic cases, a university actually took one of its car parks, managed to reduce the amount of parking it provided and develop that into a city halls of residence right in the city centre. And it's not always, it is one of them questions, if you don't own the car park, potentially if you lease it, what development opportunities are there? But for many employers, a lot of their car parks were clogged up with commuters, but shouldn't they be there for the customers? Because that is the lifeblood for many of the retail businesses. So again, I think it's an interesting debate.
Jason, thanks a lot for your insight there and your experience. I'm going to broaden out actually the kind of question I just asked you, maybe, and to go into a general point which has very specific application here in Glasgow, and maybe going to draw upon John and Lucy especially for this one. One or two questions coming up in the box there about the perception that stuff is done to people here in Glasgow and other cities. What can we do genuinely to engage communities, not just within neighbourhoods, but communities of interest across the equality and diversity agenda in some of these discussions? John, you said in your bit about the need for honesty, about people not behaving like experts who know what's best. Maybe I'll ask you first to maybe talk a little bit about specific means of engaging with people across neighbourhoods and across equality groups. And I'll come on to you after that, Lucy. Over to you first, please, John.
Okay, I think I take something in response. Sorry, as a bookend to what I said, I think Lucy had said something else earlier about the importance of engaging effectively and early, and of the idea. You have on the one hand you've got your experts, so to speak, and technical professionals. I think we need to really value that. But on the other hand, Lucy said something about the fact that local people know a lot about their local area and you need to understand that. And so I think one of the key things, and one of the biggest challenges I think for local authorities in engaging, it's a relatively small number of officers may be tasked with looking at livable neighbourhoods and low traffic neighbourhoods across a whole city, as you are in Glasgow. I mean, even in my borough, each one of those LTNs is quite different. They're different types of neighbourhoods. And actually to have the time and almost the emotional intelligence to think, okay, these are some general principles. The reason we're doing this is the same, but how will that play here? What might the messaging be necessary here? What kind of, how do we engage with different people here? There's a business community in this one that needs to be spoken to, as well as the residents community. There are different types of course, residential communities, and one of the big challenges in some of the work we're doing at the moment, as I touched upon, is the residential community is often quite different from the residential community within a relatively quiet neighbourhood. Already, quiet neighbourhood is quite different often, and certainly in terms of a lot of social demographic issues. There's a lot being said, and some of it with some perfect justification, that the lower income and often BAME communities and cities tend to be clustered on the main roads because that's the nature of the built environment there, and perhaps the bigger houses within the residential areas are owned by people who are more well off. And so there's some real issues there. And I think we have the data to understand the nature of each of the communities in question. And I know it's tricky and time consuming to get into the granular detail of that. But I think if you don't understand your community, you don't know really how well to engage with them or how best to engage. Very often you have groups that you can engage through, and that's extremely helpful. You need to be careful, however. My experience of this is that actually some of those groups aren't necessarily themselves representative, so they might purport to be. Some of them are very representative, but only of parts of the community. I suppose I'd go back to my broader point on this, which was it's all very well thinking you've got the right idea and that we need to do something like this. It's how do we get it done? And in terms of the concerns that people often have about time, I know there's a specific issue at the moment in the COVID-19 emergency and a lot of the funding deadlines for spending some of that stuff. But my general view is actually it's worth spending the time up front, because actually in the long run and over the lifetime of the scheme, it'll get something better done. And it's really challenging, as I say, for local authorities with a limited number of staff, and sometimes the people involved, different types of professional, the transport planners perhaps who design things, the engineers who put them in, the guys who maintain them, the comms folk, other people who are involved in the messaging. That can be quite difficult, and especially now that we're meeting virtually. But this idea is that basically let's dignify each neighbourhood and the people in it and the different types of stakeholders within it. Let's spend our time trying to work that out. There are some specific tools you can use for that. I'm sure people are familiar, and we can perhaps talk about them in due course, but that's enough from me. Lucy.
Thanks, John. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you. I would think that John said something really interesting, which is this issue about scale. And, you know, Amanda Burden, who used to be the Commissioner for Planning of New York City, she said, you know, New York City is a city of opportunity and it's a city of neighbourhoods. And I always, when I heard her say that, I thought that's right. You know, cities are cities of neighbourhoods. They're not, you know, these great metropolitan scale things. They're actually very different in their identity and in their demographics and in some of their issues. So I think actually thinking about the complexity of a neighbourhood is a really important point, John. And I also think that actually that in this weird, crazy, terrible year of 2020, we do now see our neighbourhoods. We've been locked into our local environs. So actually thinking about the super local and who we live next to, and actually that point that Daisy made about being perhaps kinder and gentler in terms of actually trying to find some of these paths through. So I think that, you know, it goes back to, you know, Agenda 21 and all the stuff that was talked about in the late 90s in terms of we've got to find the solutions. We don't know what the solutions are, and somebody saying it top down isn't going to be a solution. It's actually going to be something that people react to, because it isn't necessarily, they're not going to feel that the benefit of it. And if we've had whatever we've had, you know, 60 years or more of highway engineering led by the private car as being our focus of how we organise our space in cities, it's going to be painful to unpick that. It's not going to be easy, and we need creativity and we need solutions. So, you know, in some of the boroughs where we're working in London, they're really interested in citizens' juries. They're really interested in their youth council. They're really interested in ensuring it's not just the richest people and the most privileged people who are very vocal and confident, shouting the loudest, but actually making this representative of their citizens. So I think that we are in a process of a really interesting next decade, because it's urgent. It's urgent because of Black Lives Matter. It's urgent because of our public health crisis. It's urgent because of our climate emergency. And I suppose what COP26 has got is that there's a phenomenal opportunity with the right civic leadership to do exactly what Jason's saying, which is the vision, articulate the vision, and then help people to find the tools. And I love the fact that you're doing in Nottingham, that it's not penalty based. It reminded me about what Christiana Figueres, when she was doing the Paris climate thing, is like, let's just all do what we can do. You know, let's actually make this a kind of healthy competition in terms of getting to, you know, the net carbon, you know, zero carbon in terms of 2050. Let's just start doing some stuff, and let's do it in our own way rather than somebody doing it top down and getting a massive reaction.
Thanks very much, Lucy and John, for your responses there. We had a number of questions about, I suppose, street furniture and design, the role of trees in urban streets and so on, which in many ways I think you've already responded to, both of you, in terms of engaging with people. So I'm not going to put those specific ones, but we have had one or two questions about specific modes of transport which don't seem to have featured too highly so far, and I'll offer this to all three of you, but maybe bring in Jason as well from the Nottingham experience here around taxis, for instance. Are they a problem? Are they a solution? Are they both, depending how we manage things? and also use of our river. Lucy, you mentioned about the Thames earlier on. The Clyde has always been felt by Glaswegians to be an underused resource, and people have asked, could we once again maybe activate that as a means of transport? Lucy, maybe draw upon your experience there, and then come on to you, Jason, if I may, for the Nottingham experience, if you're able to, with those two modes of transport. Lucy, over to you.
I mean, I think, you know, servicing this issue about mobility justice in terms of people need to get places, and they need to do that, and they need to have options, and it needs to be multimodal. So I think in terms of taxi and, you know, new innovation that we can do in terms of shared transport, you know, really needs to be thought about holistically. There's no point just doing a kind of, you know, lacking the full holistic analysis in terms of the mobility issues. So, I mean, I'll probably let Jason speak about taxis a bit more, because I'm sure that that has been part of your thinking about your city centre. In terms of our sort of, you know, we've got a highway of nature rushing through London twice a day. The River Thames is this incredible kind of super highway, and it's been cut off. You know, it has been lost, you know, in terms of the jobs that were on the river, you know, all of the, you know, sort of logistics around the river as a world city, just like the Clyde. So over many years, many fantastic campaigns have happened about the Thames Path, making it accessible, actually putting in the legislation, making sure the riparian boroughs work together. But we're now moving into a completely different approach with the illuminated river, thinking about the evening and night time, and actually thinking about this issue about the canals and walking and cycling linked to actually new uses on the river, to really put it back at the heart of, you know, the city's identity. And I think that the Clyde, in terms of this proud history of the Clyde, and the fact that it ought to, again, in climate emergency, be this reminder in terms of what we all share. That's a phenomenal way that we can share all that international best practice, because, you know, everybody else has been doing it. They've been burying their big, you know, sort of roads, and they've been letting people access their rivers and reinventing it for cultural and civic amenity purposes. So we've got this huge database of international best practice on that, which we would love to share with Glasgow.
Thanks, Lucy. Jason, if you're able to reflect a little bit on the role of taxis, I'm not sure if it goes through Nottingham or is nearby, but the River Trent, is that your river?
Just on the Trent, I mean, that would be great if we could just shift the river to go to a few more employment sites and a bit closer to the city centre. But yeah, it's probably not. It's one that same with the canals as well, isn't it? We seem to have all these lovely attributes of a city, but they just don't quite fit for us. But just in terms of taxis, just to put it into context, WPL is just one of many things that we do in Nottingham. It's certainly not the silver bullet. It's part of an overall package of measures to try and sort of deliver city visions, and sustainability, economic growth, and so forth. With taxis, because I also do fleet, we're doing a lot of work in cleaning up our fleet. You know, electrification, looking at other options as well. But in Nottingham, we've got, I think it's next week, we've got the first 2 electric RCVs coming in to our fleet, so we can start to actually look at that. We've been the first with road sweepers, cage tippers, and converted over 38% of our fleet. And so the council is leading very much on trying to say, look, our electric vehicles, ultra low emission vehicles, are going to form part of this strategy. Yes, they're probably not going to be the perfect solution again, but they're going to form certainly a significant part of them cars. And if we're going to have congestion in the future, hopefully it's clean congestion. So we'll still have the congestion problem, but we won't have hopefully air quality gets better, but we're still going to have to be scratching our heads and working out how we move people around. In terms of taxis, that is something, again, that we're focusing very much on, is trying to switch that, especially we've got about 450 hackney cabs registered in Nottingham and about 1,500 private hire. And we're working very closely with them to try and show and pilot the fact that, again, they can switch to either hybrid or ULEV solutions. Because there's nothing worse than having streets full of taxis just sitting there ticking over, staying warm, spewing out all that pollution, either wait for the next train to come in. You know what I mean? What we've got to do as a city is try and sort of address that, but also work with them, because there's no point, again, just coming in with a sticker saying you better go and buy a £50,000 brand new hackney. That's not feasible for many small businesses in the taxi industry. So again, working, piloting, getting it wrong and getting it right, I suppose, is the question, isn't it? You know, this is all new technology. Somebody's got to go first. I think a lot of cities are trying. ULEVs, hydrogen's talked about as well. So yeah, I think it's watch this space, but do something now. Don't just sit and wait for the perfect solution, because it's never there. It's always a hybrid of options.
Thanks, Jason, and also Lucy. One, I think, final question, because we're going to have to finish up on time at 12 noon. For all three of you, if you can maybe just give us brief interventions with your thoughts. One or two questions have been coming up, but fundamentally, how will COVID and its response shift us in terms of transport usage, and particularly commuting to and from city centres, if we're going to continue as we are here today to be in our spare rooms for some while to come? What fundamental changes is that like to make to travel patterns and our ability to navigate place where city centres may no longer be such a strong part of that? I'll start with John and we'll move across to Lucy and Jason. John, just brief reflections, please.
Well, you're asking a traffic engineer how the whole of the future society is going to roll. I think what I'll say about this is I think we're all aware that we won't go back to how we were. I think there will be, it's already been touched upon. I think you did, Duncan. I think you spoke about, introduced the idea that people have been talking about the 15, 10, 20-minute city. I think that's a nice concept, and I think it works really well, but I think it comes back to something Lucy was talking about, the idea of a city being a city of neighbourhoods and local things. I think we are starting to value the things we can get nearer better. In London, city centre is still pretty quiet. The town centres seem to be doing a lot better, and I think that people are thinking, if I don't have to, then I won't. Now, there's obviously downsides in terms of the cultural offer of the city, but specifically. But I think we will value, I think in a sense a bit like us now, we realise this thing that was always a bit of a pain, those kind of online conferences and stuff like that was quite difficult. We've broken that. I think we've just woken up to the fact you just don't have to commute. There are other ways of doing work. So I suspect we'll get a little bit at the moment. For example, I'm in the office, as you can probably see, I'm coming in, it's a 10-mile cycle trip for me, or the tube, which is relatively quiet. I do that twice a week. Some of our colleagues who live really near are coming in every time, and there's loads of space. I think a lot of people will do that, and that'll affect not just their working lives, but their general lives. We'll do more locally if we can. And at that point, that's where we come back to, I know I would say this, but actually it's where we come back to the idea of your low traffic neighbourhoods, that idea of those things you're doing locally are kind of easier, healthier, quicker sometimes, cheaper to do if you can do them in ways other than moving by private car. A lot of things you might still feel you need to do that for, that's fine. But it's I think shorter journeys and valuing more what we have closer to our doorstep is something that is growing, and I think that's a real opportunity in terms of how we future live. And as I say, quickly going back to Lucy's New York point, that the whole idea of neighbourhoods is bigger now than it was. I think we will value them more, and hopefully they'll thrive better. It's a real challenge for city centres, but I'll now mute myself so I don't have to answer that challenge.
Over to you, Lucy, if you could just make some brief final comments, please.
I'll talk about the centre because we cannot hollow out our centres. We've got such phenomenal entrepreneurial energy, investment, creativity in terms of thinking how cities now, just as all of the generations before have thought. And I think Glasgow in particular, Glasgow's never been complacent. It's always been ambitious, thinking about its city. So now this is just our generation's challenge in terms of actually how we take that. We have to change land uses. We have to change accessibility. We have to actually think about the experience. We have to think about the evening and nighttime. We have to think about culture. We can't just be about a shopping mall in a city. It's not going to work like that anymore. We've completely changed all of our behaviours. So this is the moment for us to think big. And I think that design and urban design is a really important component of that, because a lot of people at the moment in London complain, there's some plastic bollards out on my street, and that's supposed to be my cycling infrastructure. Like, this is all we're good for? Is that what you really think, council, whichever local authority? So there's now a demand for actually people wanting things to be done more generously, more kinder, dealing with climate emergency in terms of the green infrastructure and the clean air quality, and making it accessible for all generations, children, old people, and everybody that needs to be looked after. And we need to do that in our city centres as well as in our neighbourhoods.
Thanks, Lucy. Briefly, Jason, if you could just reflect on the practical experience in Nottingham and how that's been part of your policy work.
Yeah, I think with COVID, we've seen like an almost instantaneous impact. But it's been detrimental, obviously, changing people's lives, economies, and so forth. But you also got to look at the benefits of what's been brought about in this sudden change. We've seen the impacts that we can have on climate change, air quality. Do you know what I mean? And we've also seen very quickly as lockdown started to relax, how quickly that starts to creep back. It's very, people almost saying, oh, let's get back to the normal. Well, we all know that climate change is there, and climate change is a long-term strategy. We've got to continue to address that. And COVID is very short-term at the moment. Do you know what I mean? Yes, it may stretch into long-term. If you've got a long-term strategy for your city, I think that's got to adapt around COVID. COVID's given us the chance to say, look, we're working from home. I mean, I'm sitting here attending this conference rather than being in Glasgow. I've just got to remember the postman next time trying to relocate himself somewhere else. But you know, it's true, isn't it? People are going to change some of their commuting behaviour, but we're still going to have congestion problems. We're still going to have air quality problems. We're still going to have to tackle climate change quicker and faster than what we're probably even doing now. And I think it's them decisions we take now, however hard they are going to benefit the next generation. And they will have to make difficult decisions themselves. This is an ongoing cycle. It's not there's a one-stop solution. I just think COVID's really changed everything in the way of thinking. It probably is an opportunity for us to do something different. If there wasn't the COVID, would we really be stepping into working from home at this sort of level, questioning where we're going as cities? So I think, yeah, it's definitely a very challenging time, but there's a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you for that, Jason. We're just on 12 noon right now, so some final comments from me before we close up. First of all, just to say that we haven't obviously been able to take all questions, but we will save them all and we will share them with our speakers, because obviously you've been putting those questions in throughout all 5 of the presentations. A video with the slides included from the presentations will be made available on social media platforms. We'll give you a link to that. I would urge you to fill in, if you haven't already done so, the Glasgow City Council public survey on these issues, which is still open on the council website to the 30th of October. And you can get that on glasgow.gov.uk/connecting communities, all one word. The whole purpose of today, the previous webinar, and those online surveys is to inform our thinking here in Glasgow. I mean, our collective thinking, not just amongst policymakers, but with communities, with elected members, with some of the agencies that are going to deliver the interventions we want to see. That'll help develop plans. You will have opportunities to be engaged in those plans once more, with the eventual publication around about a year's time, November 2021 being the intention. Finally, it remains only for me to say thank you, Ross, thank you, Daisy, Lucy, John and Jason. Fantastic, really appreciate your interventions today. It's been so exciting. Thanks especially to our friends from Landor Links, that's Juliana and Mark, who have made this possible, and to you, the almost 200 people who have been on this call this morning, for your engagement, for your energy, and for your vision that we're going to need to harness going forward for Glasgow. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.